Thanks for coming on the podcast, Peidong. Really appreciate it. So you're flying all the way from Singapore to Ottawa, right? So you're here for a conference. But why don't you tell us about a little bit about what you do and your background?
Sure. I'm Peidong. I'm currently an assistant professor at National Institute of Education in Singapore. Over there, I teach sociology courses to undergraduate students who are training to be secondary school social study teachers. So that's what I do for work. In terms of research, my interests are in the sociology of educational mobility. So I've worked on projects like, Chinese international students in Singapore, migrant teachers, Indian students pursuing medical education in China. Those are some of the projects I've worked on. I'm interested in why young people pursue educational mobility, namely, education in another country. What are the motivations? What are the social consequences of that? What are the aspirations? And what are the different pathways that lead them to different outcomes in education? Yeah.
And I mean, from our time in Oxford together, when we overlapped that year, you shared with me your story. That actually sounds very much like your own personal story, right? Can you tell us a little bit about your own story and like where you're from, and is this a path that you walked on yourself?
Yeah, okay, sure. So I guess, it is no surprise that I worked on educational mobility because I have lived that myself. So when I was 17, studying at the second year of my senior middle school in China, I was offered a scholarship by Singapore government to move to Singapore to receive my undergraduate education. So that became the starting point of my educational mobility. So I went to Singapore. I get my first university degree there, and from there I got two other scholarships that allowed me to pursue my master's and PhD in the UK. So that's how I ended up in Oxford doing my PhD, where I met you. So I sort of spent, I left China when I was 17, so I spent more than 12 years abroad, receiving my postgraduate education, undergraduate and postgraduate education. Yeah.
So when you left, but when you left China, though, I mean, you were 17. You're the only child, I assume.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, when you left China, then you're all alone. I mean, when you were in China, did you do the whole like moving to another school away from your home? Like, were you in a boarding school as well?
Not really. So I'm from a pretty ordinary Chinese family, I would say. I was from this town called Nanchang, which is a provincial capital city of Jiangxi province. I guess I would say I was born into a sort of middle class family. So I studied in a fairly good school in the city, but it was never really. I never had to travel far for my school.
So during that time, until 17, you were with your family then.
Yeah.
But after 17, you had to move abroad to Singapore by yourself. So tell us a little bit about that experience. Like, 17 is really young, and you're moving to another country, and they spoke English there. And I'm not sure how good your English was at that time, but.
Okay. So, I mean, we all had to learn English in school, and I think English is a subject I excelled in, at that time. So I really looked forward to, going abroad to study. So the opportunity to study in Singapore was something that really, I cherished. And I would say that adjusting to living in Singapore and studying in Singapore wasn't that difficult. Of course, every country, you go to a different culture, go to a different country, there are obstacles, difficulties. But Singapore being a majority Chinese ethnic, society where Chinese language is also spoken, I didn't think it was that difficult. And the Singapore government actually provided quite a good sort of bridging program that helped us ease our way in. So it wasn't that difficult, I would say.
Okay, but so when you were in Singapore though, you were there for how many years?
So I was there. So before matriculating in the university, it was a 18-month bridging program. So altogether that would be about 6 years, slightly less than 6 years. I spent half a year in Japan on exchange, by the way, during my undergraduate.
Wow. So I mean, and so your undergraduate was in Singapore.
Was in Singapore, yeah.
And then after that, you went to Cardiff.
Yes. So I got this scholarship, which allowed me to pursue my master's by research in Cardiff University.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then after that, you got into Oxford.
Yes.
For it's not sociology.
It was education. It was a DPhil in education.
DPhil in education.
Yeah.
And so basically, it sounds like when you're walking this path, and this is the research that you do,
mm-hmm.
it's almost like you're examining your own experience. I mean, this is a pretty normal thing for researchers, right? They look at their own experience,
absolutely,
and they look at it from different angles. So, what have you found in terms of educational migration and mobility,
mm-hmm.
right? Because one of the things that this podcast is specifically interested in is in soft
mm-hmm.
skills.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the things that really help people adapt and flourish when they move abroad? And I know, like, looking at the research of for someone like Vanessa Fong, right?
Yeah.
Like, even her stories, not all of them ended up well.
Yeah.
So I mean, what are some of the things that you think are really important in terms of us being able to adapt?
Sure.
When you move around like that.
Okay. Sure. If I may add, what I did for my PhD dissertation at Oxford was actually about Singapore's scholarship program for students from China. So I literally researched on the group of people that I was originally from,
mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
The
same program.
The students who are recruited by Singapore government at around 17. Given scholarship to study in Singapore. I wanted to understand these people's intercultural experiences because I think that experience of transitioning to Singapore, living in different culture, it did leave me a strong impression. And it left me wondering what was the experience of having to learn to speak a different language. Well, not from scratch, but you are interacting with people from different cultures. You are trying to blend in. You are trying to integrate. You are trying to get to know more people. So, what were the difficulties? I wanted to understand their experiences of that process. So, I would say what I found stand out in my research or in the experience I found was that in the process of intercultural communication or intercultural interaction, there is a lot potential pitfalls where stereotype could develop, where even discrimination could happen. So as migrant students, you enter a different culture, a different country, interacting with locals. They will have certain perceptions about you, the culture you are from, the country you are from, and how do you react to those? Right? I think it's always it's very central to mobile students' experience or migrants' experience in general. So I examined how students develop and mature their identity, mature their, how they experience self-transformation in this kind of process, navigate different kind of, pitfalls, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the pitfalls that they would experience? I mean, you mentioned discrimination and so on. So can you give me some examples, some stories about that?
Okay. So one thing, for example, I think in quite particular to this group of scholarship receiving Chinese students is that they are academic elites in China. Mm-hmm. So they were selected precisely because they are academically successful in China, and when they are given when they are put in local universities in Singapore, naturally their academic performance is above average compared to the local students in Singapore. And this is right, because Singapore government does want to spend money on, recruiting talent. They don't want to just recruit average students. However, when the Chinese students arrive in Singapore, they realize that local students on average are not as good as them in terms of academic performance. They sometimes they even develop a sense of hubris. They would say things like, oh, local students, they're not really good, particularly not in math and science, those kind of subjects, which Chinese education is particularly strong on, right? Mm-hmm. So there are dangers for them to develop a certain stereotype about local students that they are, somehow inferior to them. So that was the one thing that I left a very strong impression on us. Among ourselves, the scholars, we had this discourse that, oh, we are academically better, we are superior compared to the local students in the same university. But then subsequently, I realized, and many of the scholars, they realized too, that this is not the whole picture, right? Yes, you may have certain strengths in certain subjects, in certain areas, but what about other areas? The Chinese students may be stronger in science and engineering and those kind of things, but they may be less good in terms of soft skills, in terms of intercultural communication. They are generally, I would say, Chinese students, when they just arrive in Singapore, they are much less sensitive to different cultures, to multicultural communication compared to Singaporeans, because Singapore is always a very diverse, Singaporeans are very diverse people, so they are much more used to, cultural sensitivity, cultural differences. So being from China, we are less aware of those kind of things. So I start to realize, and many Chinese students start to realize that they are not as good compared to local Singaporeans in terms of managing cultural diversity, intercultural communication. Right? So that was some of the things I found.
It's interesting because it's almost like they're selected based on their hard skills, right? How fast they can, how fast and how precise they can do math and sciences.
Yeah, you could say.
But when they come over, they develop this, this complex where superiority complex where we're better than you guys, and of course there's a huge selection effect because you're selected because you're that, right?
Exactly.
But at the same time, hitting that cultural wall, and Singapore is so diverse, right? How many groups of people officially? Their ID cards actually have their ethnicity on there, right?
Yes, that's in Singapore. Officially, you have what we call CMIO, or Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other. But in fact, the population diversity in Singapore is much more than that, right? Within Chinese, there are different, originally there were different dialect groups from different regions in China, and so same for Indian and for Malay. And then the so-called other category is really a, mixed bag of all, people from all kinds of backgrounds.
Right. And so when the Chinese people come, they're proud because of their hard skills.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming they probably struggle to advance because they actually lack the soft skills. Yeah.
So there is that. So one thing we've observed, and many I talked to many scholars, and they reflect on this. They would say, yes, you may have a perfect GPA, 5.0, graduating top first class in university, but when it comes to in the corporate world, when you're working in a bank, in some kind of commercial organization, they find it hard to compete or break certain ceilings because they lack in certain social skills, soft skills, right? So that I've heard about. And another thing I've noticed about Chinese scholars is that the education back in China has this nationalistic sort of undertone to it. So many Chinese students, at least in my time, I don't know about what is it like now, we were educated to believe that Chinese civilization, Chinese culture is a very profound, deep culture that has, great achievements historically. So there is that sense of, ethnocentrism or cultural superiority that we have developed. And when we come to Singapore, we know that majority of Singaporeans are ethnic Chinese. However, they are ethnic Chinese, but Chinese culture to them may have been diluted or have is different from China because of its colonial past, Singapore's colonial past. So Chinese students, they start to feel like Singaporeans are not as good or steeped in Chinese culture compared to them. So that's another point. That's another pitfall where Chinese students develop this cultural superiority compared to them.
Right. So it's almost like Singaporean Chinese culture. It's kind of for them is like watered down.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's kind of doesn't it also reflect the traditional barbarian, right? The barbarian mentality, there's central China and then there's the fringes of China and there's the fringe island just south of China kind of mentality.
You could say that a little, and also this is actually we used to say Singapore is like, some Chinese students used to say Singapore is like a village or something because it's small. In fact, it is
but
huge.
It's so advanced.
It is so advanced, but in China, because of the nationalistic education we've received and so on, so there is always this, the bigger is the better, right? And China is a big country in every sense. So, sometimes they just develop this kind of very insensitive discourse, imaginary about, where they are, which was what I found troubling. And I wanted to, that drove me to, do my study because I wanted to understand and unpack that, experience and to see how that could have been avoided or, could have been turned into a better experience.
Now, did any, we're talking about positionality now, did any of this come from your own experience? You walked that path yourself, right? Did you walk in having superior, I'm guessing, or I don't know, feeling that like, okay, I'm coming from China, I'm better than the average Singaporean student, and did you actually, and then you hit some wall based on your soft skills as well? Was that actually your experience, or?
I guess there, yes, I just like many other Chinese students, I did have that. I probably at some point did have a little bit of sense of superiority compared to locals when it comes to academics, when it comes to certain things, right? Such as maybe the average Singaporeans don't speak Mandarin fluently and so on, their command of the language and so on, and their understanding of Chinese culture. So I think that is quite common to us. It took me a long time to start to appreciate what Singaporeans are actually capable of, and being brought up in that cultural hybridity, how powerful that is. It took me a long time to appreciate that. After I graduated from Singapore, I went to UK to study, to get my master's and PhD, and I interact with people from more diverse background. I start to realize that. Singapore is a place where you could really, that kind of diverse environment really fosters very good intercultural sensitivity, intercultural communication, right? So, for example, I would say generally being brought up as mainland, mainstream Han ethnic Chinese, we are generally not very sensitive to religious diversity, not very sensitive to ethnic diversity, whereas that in Singapore, that is something that from, just being who you are. So I think it took me a long time to appreciate what the Singapore environment, how valuable it was. And now I'm back in Singapore working there, and I would say I'm much more integrated there now than before. So I start to appreciate more what Singapore represents.
And would this be because you went to Cardiff and then you went to Oxford, and Oxford, being there. Yeah, it's in England, but it's not like England at all. It's very, it's kind of like the world compressed into one place. Yeah. And everyone's, and diversity there is actually does not reflect the UK at all, right? Yeah. And then having spent, spent time there and going back to Singapore, like, do you think that's the process of, sensitizing yourself to these different cultures and being able to navigate these, cultural symbols or be able to like relate to other people?
I think as studying at Oxford has been a very enriching experience for me. The diversity, as you say, right? The kind of people you meet there, they really have very interesting experiences. They really come from all corners of the world, literally. I would say that has added to my cultural sensitivity, and it helped me appreciate more what Singapore was. But one thing about Oxford, though, I think one thing that is perhaps less diverse about it is when it comes to class and privilege, right? So this is where perhaps the one dimension where you don't have a lot of diversity. A majority of people who end up in Oxford, who study there, they really come from relatively privileged backgrounds, right? When I say I come from an ordinary, Chinese family, but I think I still, if you look at the larger scheme of things, I suppose I'm still, fairly privileged compared to, the majority of people. So, so that was interesting for me too, to see that a place or a culture can be diverse in some aspects but not in other aspects, and So I suppose all this add to our understanding of what diversity is.
Right. So diversity is not only culture, not only religion, but social economic class. And you felt like in Oxford, a lot of the other aspects were magnified.
Yeah.
But in terms of SES, right, it's really just middle upper class, right? Middle upper class or above.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So going back to the migrant, the migrant students, I guess would that be the accurate term?
Sure. Yes.
Migrant students. Have you tracked them entering the corporate world? So after they do their studies and everything, and then they enter the corporate world, they start working, right? Does the soft skills, how does the soft skills or the lack of soft skills affect them?
I think sooner or later, because if you were talking about Chinese students, migrant students who enter workplace in Singapore, I think sooner or later they will they do encounter a very diverse workplace. In Singapore, any organization, especially in the private sector, right? It's hugely international, cosmopolitan. Your colleagues could be from anywhere in the region or beyond, right? Philippines, from Southeast Asia, and then from Western countries. So your colleagues could come from all these places. So sooner or later, my observation is that Chinese students, they do develop a stronger awareness about different cultures, different sort of people of different backgrounds. I think the issue that my PhD, my work focused on students in the university campus, right? In the university campus, several things stop these students from exposing themselves to the diversity that is around them, because Singapore government recruited these students in batches, in large numbers, several hundred,
so like cohorts.
Yeah, cohorts. So they so when they arrive in Singapore, they already have a community. They sometimes they are very closely knit, and that means that their social needs can be met within the group, within their immediate community. So there is no incentive to go beyond, to reach out. So it takes a lot of effort for them to reach beyond, and most of the time, we stay within our comfort zones, right? And on the other hand, in the university, the majority of student population would be Singaporeans, and they themselves come from a common background, so they have their social networks. Especially for the male students in Singapore, they go through this Army National Service compulsory conscription, basically, where they develop a very strong local culture mediated through their Singlish, their local lingo. So they also have very closely, communities of their own. So in the society, we find these parallel societies, if you like, that they don't, they live in the same spaces, but they don't interact as much. So in the university space, you do see this kind of maybe not as bad as segregation, but parallel, not.
So pretty much like self-autonomous bubbles.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. But once they are in the workplace, I think everyone working in an organization, whatever background they come from, they are driven. They are working towards the organization's goal. They are advancing their career. So with that objective, they will enter into genuine interaction with each other, and so I think the issue about of intercultural communication or interaction becomes less of an issue when they enter workplace, actually.
Right. So because being thrusted into the workplace, that kind of forces you to reckon with the diversity that actually is. And these students that you look at, they stay in Singapore, right?
Majority of them stay in Singapore. There's a good share who who go back to China or move elsewhere, move onward to other destinations like Western countries. Yeah.
Right. So these students then, in terms of the, does this kind of situation cause tension then within the campus?
Yes. Yes. It certainly does, because these students are on scholarship, so they are receiving certain privilege. And local students, not the majority of them wouldn't be, on government scholarship. So there is already, a certain some local students would be, would say, this is unfair that our government is giving out all this, money to foreign students.
Because it's tax money, Singaporean tax money.
Yeah, so that's a common refrain that you hear, that it's our taxpayers' money that's funding you foreign students, right? Why do you deserve it? Especially when foreign students find themselves in situations where they are vulnerable to criticism. So in Singapore, there was a famous case. There was a student called Sun Xu, and he was a graduating student at one of the universities there. One day after some unpleasant experience, in a daily life, that he posted on his social media saying something not nice about Singaporeans, and basically the local social media spotted that, and it became a event. It became a trending kind of event, and locals were criticizing the student severely, and such that until that the university had to step in and do something about him. So I think he got his scholarship, sort of revoked for the last year or something.
Wow.
Some punishment was meted out.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. So there was that. There definitely was that tension, because resources are being spent on these students, even though they may be deserving in the eyes of the Singapore government, but locals may not, may think otherwise.
Right. The Singaporean government is doing this because they want an influx of talent, right? Yeah. To boost the economy, to boost the growth, or whatever. And Singapore scores really high on the PISA and TIM score, like the international assessments. Would you say, like, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar how big these cohorts of Chinese students are, but would you say, like, these are the influx of this type of talent is what's keeping Singapore afloat in terms of their education, or?
Well, I think Singapore education system definitely is a very strong system. It does very well in preparing students for standardized tests. First of all, I think we all should take a pinch of salt about all these standardized testing, PISA or whatever.
Right.
They don't say about it's not all be all and all factor there. Having said that, I think Singapore, when it comes to basic education, mathematics and English, I think Singaporean students excels. Right, it's one of the top countries in the world when it comes to competencies in these subjects. I routinely hear from teachers in the system that migrant students, many of them are much more driven compared to local students. In general, not everyone, of course, but I think generally, because these students, they migrate, they come from a different country, their parents have stronger expectations, high expectations of them to succeed. I think this is a phenomenon that's not only unique to Singapore. In the US, we have, the Asian American achievement and all that. So I hear that, migrant students tend to work harder, and sometimes because of their educational background in the home country, they tend to do well in certain subjects as well.
Okay. You're in the Faculty of Education right now.
Yeah.
And, having seen all this, right, in your research, what would your recommendations be? Have you dealt with policy?
Well, not directly,
but if you were to make recommendations for improving the situation, what would you say would be the things that you would suggest for like this type of program, this type of migrant program?
Okay. So I think overall these scholarship programs that recruit foreign students, they are generally very successful. I think they bring in dynamism, they bring in new talent into Singapore. Singapore is a tiny city-state that thrives on connectedness. It has to be connected to the rest of the world to thrive economically, socially, and so on. So I think Singaporeans also recognize that it is important for this small country, which is not producing enough babies. Singaporeans are not, the birth rate for Singaporean locals has gone down over the last decades. So really, for the country to have a sustainable, viable population, and for it to sustain a strong economy, people recognize there is that need for this inflow of new talent. I think the issue with the controversies that we've seen is because maybe there is a perception that too many have come in too short a period of time and so on. But I think overall, foreign students coming into the system does add value to the system. It makes local students local students exposed to greater diversity as well. So you are no longer just looking at your, the familiar faces, your own country, compatriots. You get to expose at a young age to people from the countries around in ASEAN or in China, India, and that certainly helps Singaporeans, I would say. Yeah.
So in general, it sounds like you don't have a lot of. So there's no recommendations. You think it's generally this program is fine the way it is, and is there anything that you would say you would restructure in terms of enhancing experience? Like, for example, you said there was 2 bubbles. Would you want to break these 2 bubbles? Would you want to restructure it so that, the Chinese students that come are essentially forced to integrate themselves? But if so, what would the repercussions be?
Okay, so I guess the reason why I did my work on intercultural interaction communication between these scholars and locals is that I was concerned. These issues troubled me, and they were close to my heart. So right now I'm actually working as a faculty in residence in one of the university halls as well, the halls of residence, where in the block we have students like those scholarship receiving students from China. There have always been efforts on helping these students to integrate. I think we need to come up with genuine programs, effective programs to help them integrate. I don't think young people nowadays, if you look at young people nowadays, I don't think you just come up with some superficial say, oh, let's celebrate our festival together. I don't think that's a very effective way to make young people interested. We need to know what today's youth are really interested in. What are the things that really connect them and people of their age, in Singapore, right? People, their peers in the host culture. We have to create genuine connection, and that's something that has always troubled me. So I'm still working on it. I don't have any grand suggestion or or say I have any solution, but small ways of helping people to get to know more, work together, through living together, activities. Yeah. So.
So I mean, from your research, then, what would be the essential skills to for people to develop to cross these cultural borders, essentially?
Okay.
Right? I mean, sometimes, I'm sure there are some groups, some students who come to Singapore and they realize, oh, I'm in Singapore, I should probably make something out of this, learn more about the other side. But they're always stuck in the Chinese bubble. Yeah. What would be some essential skills that they need in order to develop that cultural sensitivity and cultural, the soft skills to navigate this?
Okay. Well, I think perhaps more than skills, I think attitude is important. I've seldom thought about these things in terms of skills, but I've also more thought of them as an issue of attitude or your outlook. I think it is very important that we migrant students, when they enter a different culture, go to a different place, they suspend judgment, or at least try to hold back the kind of value that the kind of cultural background they come from. Don't immediately jump into some judgment about the people they encounter, because they need to be aware that there are a lot of things about the host country that they don't know. There are a lot of things about the host people that they really don't know. There's a history to every individual person. There's a history. There are complex histories to communities that you encounter. Only if you know a little bit about those kind of histories behind these people can you actually interact with the people better. So I think many of the problems that I saw or I encountered myself was because we really didn't know the place that we were going to, in this case Singapore, that well. We didn't know where it came from, its colonial history, what were its socio-political, economic history, the trajectory, and what does that mean for this people that we are encountering. So I think it is very important for migrant students to have this attitude of humility and a learning attitude, an open attitude to learn about differences. Yeah, so I hesitate to say skills, but I think that attitude and that sort of orientation is very important.
So when you say, the attitude of suspending judgment, of imposing your cultural worldview upon them, and I guess these skills then, this worldview or this attitude is also applicable to other places.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like generally, when you go to a new place, just suspend judgment before jumping to your conclusions about this thing's stupid, it's a waste of my time. So in terms of in terms of your research, and what's the future direction of what you want to do with this?
Okay, so right now I would say my research is always at the intersection between education and mobility / migration. So I've worked on migrant students before. Currently I have a project on migrant teachers. So it is again about migration and education, but now this time I'm looking at teachers who migrate from say China or India to teach in Singapore schools, and many of these teachers are so-called mother tongue teachers. They teach in Singapore. There are these ethnic languages are called mother tongues because they are supposed to be the cultural a language that's linked to the students' ethnicity, and that's supposed to have a cultural significance to it, right? So culture and mother tongue is in Singapore perceived as a vehicle for passing on value. And now we have this interesting situation where foreigners, migrants are coming in to teach locals about their so-called mother culture or mother tongue. So, I think this is a place where, we can potentially see quite a bit of attention, or how the migrant teacher's background could, influence, how students perceive about their own culture and language. So, so this is a project I'm currently working on.
Right, that's really fascinating, because when we talk, literally just what you said about 5 minutes ago, when you said about students going to a new place and suspending judgment, that applies to teachers too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. they go there and they start teaching. Tamil is one of the languages, right?
Yes.
Right. So for example, you get a teacher from India fly over, teach Tamil culture, and they start thinking you know what? Y'all Tamil culture ain't real Tamil culture. Funny how I said that in a kind of a black way, right? But that's what I assume that's what you're going to find.
So that's one of the things that was one of my hypotheses, and I do see more of that happen with Chinese teachers. So a lot of teachers who are teaching mother tongue Mandarin in Singapore, they used to be language teacher in China as well, teaching Chinese literature, Chinese language, and language is a heavily ideologically loaded matter.
How so?
Well, language is, when we think about language and literature, right? Those are vehicles of ideas, right? You read about, ancient Chinese history, a Chinese poem, or, a certain passage. Those have, cultural values deposited in it. So what I found in my research was that when Chinese teachers teach Singaporeans, they had to actually hold back the cultural connotation of certain language teaching, because they felt that in the context of China they could use language as a vehicle or as a medium to teach values, but in Singapore language has become very instrumentalized. It's just a tool where you really is a tool for communication, not much beyond that. I've encountered some Chinese language teachers who felt not very satisfied with their work because they felt their work has been sort of reduced to just one instrumental dimension, where they cannot go into values, history, and all that.
So it's almost like, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost, well, number one, coming from mainland China to Singapore, you're going from simplified to traditional. Mm-hmm.
No, that's not the case.
Really?
So Singapore's the official Chinese curriculum follows mainland China.
Oh, really? So it's simplified.
And I think it's a conscious decision.
Right.
That Singapore
has it always been that way, or is it's more of a recent thing?
I as far as I know, in the maybe this changed in the last 2 decades. I'm not sure about earlier time. I mean, I think in the schools, right, the mother tongue, they've certainly followed mainland Chinese in the since 1980s. Right, and I think it's a conscious decision because China was, opening up and it represented the opportunity. There is this very strong push from a Singapore government to say that we have to be connected,
to be aligned with that,
to be aligned with China as as the land of opportunity.
Right, because Singapore established their statehood because they separated themselves from Malaysia. We're not like Malaysia.
Yeah.
Right. We're more Chinese. I'm not very good with Singaporean history. Is that approximately in the ballpark?
Yeah, that was because Singapore has a higher proportion of Chinese ethnics, so it didn't fit well. I mean that's the official historical narrative, that it didn't fit well with a Malay majority in Malaysia, so it had to leave.
So going back to the teachers, they can teach their. So when they teach their Chinese culture, there's the whole the central cultural fluorescence, 中华文化, right?
Yes.
And when they go to Singapore, they expect to teach how great the Chinese culture is and so on. But in Singapore, because of the mother tongue system, and there's like multiple ethnicities and multiple languages. Language has essentially been boiled down in a very utilitarian kind of way.
Yes.
It's a tool for communication.
Yes.
And you probably want to tone down the cultural superiorities of each language so that just because you don't want them, going against each other, right? You don't want to install these ideologies into the students.
Yeah.
And so that's basically what the teachers are disillusioned about, I assume.
Some of them, not all. I wouldn't say all. I mean, there are also teachers who just, for them, teaching language is just a job. It's a livelihood, so they would just do it. But especially for those Chinese teachers who used to be teachers back in China as well, shifting to adjusting to teach Chinese in Singapore, was a challenge for them because they had to. First of all, the level of difficulty, the level at which they teach, it has to be readjusted. And then, as we discussed,
like does mean dumbed down.
Yes,
okay.
in a sense.
Yes.
And then and because in Singapore working language is English and it's a very westernized place. So one of the teachers shared with me that if you talk about Chinese traditional idiom in Singapore, right, a lot of times students don't really understand because they don't have that wider cultural background to understand these.
Can you give me an example? You can speak Chinese for this one.
I can't I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I've heard of teachers saying something to that effect.
Right. So if you say an idiom, but that idiom is actually referring to the spring and autumn period, some type of historical event in the spring autumn period.
Exactly.
And the Singaporeans like what that level of history is like way above them.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm not saying that every Chinese citizen just because they are in China they are more acquainted with this culture. I wouldn't say that they are in a way that they are learned about them. It's just that because in China you would somehow be exposed to these things. These things will be in the background. So there is that basis for you to connect on these idioms, historical, stories and whatever. Right. But in Singapore, language has been reduced to that utilitarian thing, that tool for communication. So there is not that space for more value, more to come in.
Now, so far we've looked at the mechanisms for migrant students in Singapore. We looked at some of them for the migrant teachers. How about the other way around? Because you say you also look at Indian students in China.
Oh yeah.
In as medical students, right?
Yes, yeah.
Right. I mean, are the mechanisms the same?
No. So this is it was a small project that I pursued, during my postdoc years. And it was very interesting. So what I found basically when I returned to my hometown in China, I discovered that the university in my hometown, which is not a well-known university, I guess it's a decent university, but it's not in anywhere near well known internationally.
So second,
third tier university in China, and it had a significant number of foreign students, mostly coming from developing countries, South Asia and Middle East,
Africa.
Some Africa.
So this is from would it be from the One Belt One Road initiative or not exactly?
Well, in those days, the One Belt One Road still wasn't there wasn't the discourse there. Yeah, it wasn't a thing yet.
But it was more of a China helping developing countries in Africa and Middle East. I think the ones where they say we'll send migrant workers over but you just give us a mine kind of thing. Is it these kind of exchange programs or?
It wasn't. So it was interesting that in fact the Chinese university charged it was commercial to them actually.
Oh, okay.
So there were about 50 Chinese universities, most of them second or third tier universities They set up English medium medical degree programs catered to foreign students. And majority of these foreign students come from developing countries in Asia, Africa, Middle East. And I followed upon a group of students from India more closely for my field work. So what I realized that we sometimes imagine that China attracted them because of China's rise and soft power and all that, but it wasn't the case. For the Indian students who studied in the university where I looked at, they didn't know much about China. They didn't know much about education in China. So what China represented for them? It represented for them a convenient second chance, or affordable second chance to to get a medical degree, which they cannot achieve in India itself, because in India either you have to be academically extremely successful or select good to get into public medical college, or you have to have money to enter private college because they charge humongous amount of fees. So China actually offered a sort of affordable program which allows these students to get a medical degree, and with that they will go back to India to qualify for the national board examination in order to practice. So it was actually a compromise for them.
But in China's degree, it's applicable there. Like they can use it.
It was recognized. It is recognized. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes some of the university could get disqualified if they if their programs are found to be lacking and so on. So that actually, I've published this, so I can say this. So with the field site university that I looked at, at some point, after a few years of running the program, they actually failed a certain inspection from the Chinese Ministry of Education, and so the university was suspended from recruiting foreign students on their English language medical program for a few years. Yeah.
And the students who were trained in China that went back to India, did it affect them or?
No, well, the students who were already there, they could still graduate. It's just that they, for a number of years, the university was not allowed to recruit more students onto the program. Okay. So, but I think their credentials were still recognized. Mm-hmm. And I think as far as Indian government is concerned, they put their trust, or they put the quality control at the point of their domestic, their national medical board exam, right? Mm-hmm. Right, I think it's called Medical Council of India, so MCI exam. Mm-hmm. So as long as students have a medical degree, which they now get, some of them get from China, and they pass the MCI exam, they are qualified doctors. Okay. So that's how it works.
Okay. And now, when we're going back to the mechanisms of adapting to a new place, right? When Indian students go to China, do they have? Does the same thing happen as it does in Singapore? Do they feel like, you said they don't really know what China is. For them, it's just a second chance.
Yeah.
Is there what happens when an Indian student ends up in China?
Okay, so this is actually a very different story from my research on Chinese scholarship students in Singapore. It was for the Indian students when they are in China. Their intention was actually never. There was no intention to settle down in China. For them, as I said, right, going to China was to get a medical degree at an affordable rate and then go back to India. And China is not really an immigration destination country. So, and most of these Indian students are not, they don't have prior, knowledge of Chinese language, and they usually, because they have to balance, the medical, study, which is already heavy, so they usually don't excel in learning Chinese language. Most of them don't. Some do. So settling or working in China is never really a option. It's not very likely. And in the university campus, you see a very clear segregation between these Indian or other foreign students and the Chinese students. They are accommodated separately. They live in different buildings. Their social life is completely separate. And even here, I think there is the issue of discrimination still comes in. I mean, most of these students come from developing countries that are less developed than China. Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, some Chinese students they look down on them. They think these are students coming from poorer countries. They don't speak Chinese or English well, and so there was a lot of segregation. Yeah, it was not I wouldn't say interculturally it was a very fruitful experience for either the local Chinese students or the international students in this case.
Right, because it seems like a lot of these students, they go over, it's just for a degree, it's a very fleeting thing, probably just 3 years of their lives.
Yeah.
And then they're gone, in and out, right? And then some Chinese students, they see Indians, and some parts of China, you still have those situations where if you're a white guy walking down the street, you'll have like kids walk up to you and they can take a picture of you.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Stuff, right?
Yeah,
that's still the case, especially in like third tier cities, right?
Yeah.
So if you have an Indian person there, that's also for them different. And I assume then all the discrimination, the biases just come up.
Yes, So I did find that in my research.
And how did the Indian students adapt to this? What was it about? You talked about changing your attitude and worldview earlier, but I mean, was that a thing for them, or was that just get it over with for 3 years and go home?
For the majority of them, is that.
Uh-huh.
For a small number of them, I think they did take opportunity of this, mobility and this experience of living in different countries. So some of them I have encountered as well, some Indian students who have picked up Chinese language and interacted more with their local students or faculty. And for them, really, for these people who take the effort, it can be a fruitful experience. So I've had one case where, this Indian guy who picked up, who graduated from, a Chinese university with a degree, but then he decided to actually become a recruitment agent for future Indian students who want to embark on this kind of programs. Oh. And he tapped into his network and his Chinese language to do that. So for some of them, that intercultural experience, turns into something, fruitful in career terms. But majority of them, I think, as you described, they are just here to get the degree and to get it done as soon as possible, and then go back. Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that case because we hear the term in academia at least we hear the term like cultural brokers, right? Where they're able to navigate both sides, and that's really the agents of transnationalism. You're able to live in China, and you're also able to live in India, and through that you create opportunities. Yeah. Right. And would you say this is an important skill that's coming up? Because the world's getting smaller, transnationalism is still happening, despite there is some pushback with populism nowadays, and nativism, and also more authoritarian positions, especially in North America and Europe. Would you say, Phil, being a cultural broker is going to be a key factor in terms of soft skills in the future? Absolutely.
I think it creates a lot of opportunities. I mean, that was a good case in point. This was someone who turned his intercultural experience into his career opportunity. So I definitely say But I think so. Here is where I think individual efforts does come in. Your individual outlook. why is it that the majority of the students, they've decided that China is just going to be this transient place for me, most of the time they spend their time in the dormitory, listening to their home, music from or movie from their home country, and they go through lessons, they go through the motion, then they go back to their country. Where others, they do see an opportunity. Yeah, that's a puzzle to me as well. I think sometimes maybe it's just, individual... it's an individual difference. I don't know.
It comes down to the individual.
Yeah.
I mean, because in your case, you went to Singapore, and then you went to the UK, and you made something out of this whole transnational experience. Not everyone did that. I mean, some people went back. I am assuming. Mm-hmm. Some people went back to China. Mm-hmm. Some people stayed in Singapore, mm-hmm. And lived a very Singaporean lifestyle mm-hmm. after they integrate. And so it's like It's like, I would say it seems for me it's almost like a matter of choice, whether that person decides to maximize the experience. I mean, when you were in Oxford, you were there for 4 years, 5 years?
4 years, including the 1 year which I actually spent doing field work in Singapore.
So really for 4 years. I mean, would you say you saw some Chinese people there that, they primarily hung around Chinese people? They basically never... they were at Oxford, but they weren't really at Oxford. They were more like hanging out with Chinese friends all the time.
I suppose there would be some of those. But on the other hand, I wouldn't, I don't think I've done anything out of the, anything extraordinary. Because nowadays academia is very international. If you look at, the academics working in Singapore like myself, most of us have very cosmopolitan, international experiences. Having studied in, 2-3 countries is quite common. Mm-hmm. And Singapore likes this kind of people. It is, as I said, a country that thrives on, its connectedness to the rest of the world. So I don't think I've done anything extraordinary. It's just, going back to Singapore. And of course, and here again, I also want to say that there is this thing called cultural capital, cosmopolitan cultural capital. So
for those who are unfamiliar with that, can you explain what that means?
Okay, so cultural capital is sociologist Bourdieu's idea that it's basically what you know and your experiences, the ensemble of your knowledge, your experiences, the kind of things your knowledge, yeah. So having studied in different places and having that experiences recognized through academic credentials, right? It gives you certain recognition. So and people's access to these cultural capital is sometimes conditioned upon class. As I said, Oxford isn't a place for it's a majority for people who are mostly privileged. So what I'm trying to say is that I think the fact that I could now work as an academic in Singapore in a internationally recognized university, there is a certain I'm lucky, but it's I sometimes question how fair that luck is. Maybe I have
What do you mean when you question how fair that luck is? I mean, isn't it through your hard work?
I think there is always an element of luck. I'm sure there are people who work as hard as me and who have just done same amount of work and so on, but they don't necessarily get the kind of opportunities I got. So sometimes, luck does play a hand in where we are in life and so on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I'm losing a bit of the chain of thought.
No, no, you're jet lagged from Singapore, so that's pretty normal. So we're coming to an end, anyways.
Sure.
So to wrap up, though, if you're to give recommendations for people, because you're very unique from other people, like from some other people I've interviewed. You come from a very cosmopolitan, like Singapore, right? Mm-hmm. It's probably as cosmopolitan as you can get, mm-hmm. At a global level. What would be the key recommendation you would make to people if they want to be able to, just uproot themselves and flourish in other communities or in other cities or in other cultures? what's going to be the key for the future of globalization?
Well, I think an open mind, I would say, it sounds like a cliche, but whether you can turn an experience into an opportunity, just like the Indian students we were talking about. Why do some of them, end up spending, 3-4 years in Singapore, in China, but not picking up much Chinese, while others could, develop fluent Chinese, language ability, and that turns into their career opportunity. I think really, it's that attitude that you want to turn this experience into something useful, something enriching. When opportunities are in front of you, when people of different backgrounds are there, right? Do you take that step, to know them more, to learn something new? I'm not saying that I'm very good at it. I actually think I don't do enough of it. So I would say that would be, if there is a key, that open attitude, that desire to turn your experience into something positive that's enriching. It's really important. I think more than skills, that attitude, that outlook determines, skills you can always, I would say, you can always hone your skills, you can always pick up, new skills.
Learn a new language.
Yeah, but that attitude, that orientation is something that we need to, reflect on and cultivate, I suppose. Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm not sure how useful this is.
No, it's great to hear your story and coming from a very international perspective, because you're in Ottawa right now, and Ottawa is actually relatively international because it's the political capital. But you'll also find that it could also be somewhat provincial, because Canada is it's multicultural. We say it's multicultural, but at the same time, it has its own quirks as well. And I don't know if you'll be able. You might be, with your sensitivity, you'll probably be able to pick up on some of it in the next few days.
Okay.
Yeah. So I hope you enjoy your stay here as well.
Yeah, I'm sure I will. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for your time.